An appropriate emotional response is then activated to minimize the expected harmful effect. For example, imagine that someone previously experienced a serious problem during a particular sequence of events. Later, a similar sequence begins to develop. The individual may experience an emotional reaction before the same final event actually occurs. According to our model, this is because the current pattern resembles a previous pattern associated with danger. It is important to understand that the brain is making a prediction. The predicted disaster has not necessarily happened yet. The emotional response is being generated because the brain considers it possible that something serious may happen. 3. Triggering mechanisms. At this point, we can see that the 3 types of triggering mechanisms consist of 2 mechanisms based on identification information, while the remaining mechanism operates on the direct pain sensation. The mechanism based on direct physical pain is relatively simple and has already been explained. The 2 mechanisms operating on identification information require further attention. The main difference between these 2 mechanisms is the way the relevant information is stored in memory. This difference can be understood through a simple example. Video clips and still photographs. Important events in our lives are generally recorded in 2 different ways. Think about how we record memorable events today. We commonly use video clips and still photographs. These represent 2 different ways of storing information. This provides a simple model for understanding the difference between the 2 types of memory involved in emotional triggering. Memory of a sequence of events, like a video clip. The first type can be understood as a memory of a sequence of events. It is similar to a video clip. For example, imagine that you remember an unpleasant event, not as one single picture, but as a series of things that happened one after another. First, something happened. Then something else happened. Then another event followed. And finally, the unpleasant event occurred. The memory therefore contains a sequence. According to our model, prediction based on this type of memory compares the stored sequence with information received during the last few minutes. But there is an important requirement. If we are comparing 2 video clips, the recently received information must also be combined into a similar continuous pattern. Therefore, comparison of this nature essentially requires a process that combines information received on a continuous basis. This explains why the first category of precaution involves disturbing the process of combining sensory inputs. If the continuous stream is interrupted, the developing pattern may not be completed in the same way, and the comparison with the past pattern may be reduced. Consider a modern example. Suppose someone previously experienced a frightening incident while traveling on a particular road at night. If years later, the same person travels along a similar road under similar conditions, a series of sensory inputs may gradually develop into a pattern resembling the earlier experience. The road, lighting, sounds, weather, movement, and other information may collectively form a developing sequence. According to our model, it is this continuous pattern that may contribute to the prediction of danger. Still, pictures and static identification. Now let us consider the second type. Comparison of still pictures with current information does not require the same continuous combining activity. In this case, the information being received at the moment in the form of a still picture-like pattern can be compared with a similar record stored in memory. That record may be marked with a very high pain-generating potential, according to past experience. The spider phobia example illustrates this mechanism well. A person may see a picture of a spider. There is no continuous sequence of events leading to the reaction. The identification of a particular static pattern may itself be sufficient to activate the stored association. Therefore, the mechanism is different from the one involving a continuously developing sequence. An important clarification. At this point, I would like to make an important clarification. The explanation presented here does not claim to describe the actual detailed processes that take place inside the brain. It is a simple model for understanding the mechanism of emotional generation. The real processes occurring inside the brain are much more complex. However, this simple model is useful because it gives us a practical way to prepare ourselves when we are forced to face situations that may trigger emotional responses. The purpose of the model is therefore not to provide a complete neurological explanation. Its purpose is to help us understand the relationship between present sensory information, past experiences, predictions of possible danger, physical pain, and emotional responses. Once we understand these relationships, we can begin to prepare appropriate strategies. Developing the required skills. It is important to note that the skills required to handle each triggering mechanism are different. Similarly, the action that should be adopted at the moment of facing the danger can also be different. This is why analyzing our emotional history record is so important. The history record can help us identify which type of triggering mechanism is most likely to affect us. It can also help us select the appropriate strategy. For example, if our problem is mainly associated with a continuously developing pattern, we may need to develop the ability to interrupt or redirect the process of combining sensory inputs. If our problem is associated with the identification of a particular static object or situation, we may need to develop the ability to focus on the activity of receiving information rather than immediately becoming absorbed in its identification. If physical pain is the main trigger, we may need to develop the ability to focus carefully on the relevant part of the body and reduce the attention given to the unpleasant sensation as a whole. Therefore, emotional history is not merely a record of our past difficulties. It can become a training guide. It can reveal the mechanisms that are most likely to trigger our emotional responses. It can also reveal the skills that we have not yet developed adequately. In other words, the history record can help us identify our skill gaps. Once these gaps have been identified, we can deliberately work on developing the missing skills. This gives us a more systematic way of dealing with emotional triggering. Instead of simply waiting for the next emotional reaction and trying to control it after it has already become intense, we can study our previous experiences, identify the likely triggering mechanism, prepare an appropriate strategy, and gradually develop the skills needed to reduce the harmful effects. That is the practical value of understanding the main categories of emotional triggering mechanisms. We will further elaborate on the practical methods of managing negative emotions in future talks. Thank you.